Have you ever thought about what it would take to run a massive, continent-sized empire, but in the ancient world? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain on the Mauryan Empire, a civilization that was an absolute masterclass in managing power and people on an epic scale. Okay, so first things first, just look at this map. This isn't your average kingdom. We're talking about a sprawling continental power. Just try to imagine governing a territory that stretches from the massive Hindu Kush mountains all the way to the plains of the Ganges, and doing it all without, phones or email or any modern tech. That was the staggering challenge the Mauryans were up against. So having a huge map is one thing, but actually running a massive empire, that's a whole different ballgame. It's not just about conquering territory, it's about controlling it day in and day out. So how on earth did the Mauryans pull it off? What's the secret sauce that makes an empire so different from just a regular old kingdom?
To really get a handle on this, we've got to zoom in a bit and look at the empire's urban heartbeat, their cities, because these weren't just places where people lived. They were the command centers, the economic engines, really the cultural melting pots of the whole Mauryan world.
The entire empire was basically anchored by a network of powerful, connected cities. We're going to take a closer look at three of the most important ones to see how this worked: Pataliputra, Taxila, and Ujjain. First up, let's head to the imperial capital, Pataliputra. Now, this wasn't just another city. This place was a statement. I mean, picture a huge metropolis protected by this massive wooden wall that had hundreds of towers and gates. This was the absolute nerve center of the empire, where every big decision was made. All right, next we're traveling way out to the rugged northwest frontier, to the city of Taxila. You can think of this place as the empire's gateway to the rest of the world. It was a bustling hub for trade and culture, where you'd find merchants, scholars, and soldiers from all over Asia. It was really the cosmopolitan edge of the empire. And finally, we've got Ujjain. You got to think of this city as a vital artery that kept the whole empire's lifeblood, its trade, flowing. It was right at the crossroads of major trade routes, so it was basically the beating heart of the Mauryan economy, pumping goods and people from the north to the south and back again. Okay, so we've seen the big urban centers, but what about the people? Who actually called this giant empire home? From the sophisticated folks in the cities to the hunters in the forests, the Mauryan Empire was a true kaleidoscope of cultures and lifestyles. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating parts: the incredible human mosaic of the Mauryan Empire. You can forget any idea of a single, uniform culture. This was a world of breathtaking diversity, a patchwork of different peoples, each with their own unique traditions. I mean, this gives you a little glimpse into the totally different worlds that existed side by side. In those big cities we just talked about, you had your merchants, officials, and artisans. But head out into the countryside and you find the farmers and herders who were literally feeding the entire empire. And then, deep in central India, you had forest dwellers living a completely different kind of life, hunting and gathering. And all that diversity created this vibrant tapestry of cultures. We're talking about tons of different languages being spoken, a whole rainbow of different clothing styles, and all sorts of different food. Now, for the Mauryan rulers, just holding this multicultural empire together, well, that was a constant, high-stakes balancing act. So you might be thinking, okay, it's big, I get it, so what? Isn't an empire just a supersized kingdom? And yeah, it's a tempting thought, but the reality is way more complicated. The difference isn't just about size, it's about substance. So let's really dive into this imperial challenge. What makes running an empire so fundamentally different from ruling a kingdom? Well, it pretty much all boils down to one simple word: scale. Think about it like this. A kingdom is kind of like a local corner store. An empire, on the other hand, is like a massive multinational corporation. You need way more resources, a much bigger security team, or in this case, army, and a whole lot more bureaucracy just to keep the lights on. It's a completely different level of complexity. And that really gets to the heart of it. To rule an empire, you need a huge, well-oiled administrative machine, a complex system of officials, tax collectors, you name it, all working just to keep the whole thing from collapsing under its own weight. It's the invisible infrastructure holding it all together. So, what have we learned here? The Mauryan Empire was a masterclass in ancient government, a delicate dance between raw power and a hugely diverse population. But the ultimate challenge was still there. How do you create a sense of unity out of all that variety? How do you unite people not just with armies, but with an idea? Well, that's a story for another time. a story about an emperor who tried to conquer hearts and minds, not just land. Okay, just imagine this for a second. You've got to run a country that's basically the size of a continent. But you have no phones, no internet, not even a reliable postal service. That's the absolutely massive challenge the Mauryan emperors were up against more than 2,000 years ago. So how on earth did they do it? How did they create a system so effective it could hold an entire subcontinent together? Well, let's dive in. First off, we really need to get our heads around the sheer scale of this thing. The Mauryan Empire wasn't just, a big kingdom. It was a colossal power that stretched across pretty much the entire Indian subcontinent. I mean, look at this. We're talking about a territory packed with all kinds of different landscapes, tons of different cultures, and millions of people. Trying to manage all of that would be a huge job, even with today's technology. And that brings us right to the central puzzle, the big question. How could one single ruler possibly maintain control, collect resources, and make sure their laws were followed across such a massive area? I mean, without any modern tech, it just seems impossible, right? But the Mauryans, well, they had an answer, and it was a really clever, multi-layered system of government. So their strategy was pretty brilliant, and it was actually pretty simple. Start at the very heart of the empire. They figured, hey, if you want to control all those faraway places, you've first got to have an ironclad grip on your own backyard. And that central zone, right around the bustling capital city of Pataliputra, that was managed totally differently from anywhere else. In this area, the emperor's control was direct. It was absolute. His word was law, simple as that. There was nobody in between to water down his power. And what's so fascinating about this is how kind of modern it feels. The emperor didn't just rely on local lords. No, he appointed his own officials for specific jobs. Collecting taxes, making sure people follow the rules. And the key thing here is that these guys weren't powerful landowners. They were paid professionals. Their loyalty was to the emperor, not their own little patch of land. And to make sure everyone stayed loyal, a huge network of spies acted as the emperor's eyes and ears, keeping a check on corruption or any funny business. Okay, so that works for the area right around the capital. But what about all those territories hundreds and hundreds of miles away? You just can't manage those with the same micromanagement. So the Mauryans came up with a second layer of control. They organized these faraway areas into provinces, and each one was ruled from a major city. You had places like Taxila, way up in the northwest, which was basically the gateway to Central Asia. And then there was Ujjain, a super important hub for trade. These weren't just random cities. They were basically mini capitals, projecting the emperor's power out into the regions. And this is where you can really see how smart their system was. It was flexible. So while the core area had that strict top-down control, the provinces were often run by royal princes acting as governors. And sure, they enforced the emperor's main laws, but they also had enough leeway to let local customs and traditions continue. It was just a really practical way to rule a huge, diverse empire without trying to force everyone to be exactly the same. All right, so you've got this really sophisticated system of control set up. But how do you actually connect it all? How do you move your armies around, get your officials where they need to go? And probably most important of all, how do you collect all the wealth that keeps the whole thing running? Well, the answer was all about controlling the empire's lifeline. And by lifelines, I mean infrastructure. The Mauryas knew a simple truth. If you control the roads and the rivers, you control the empire. These routes were like the arteries of the whole operation. They were essential for moving troops, for trade, and for bringing all those valuable resources back to the center. The empire's economy basically ran on two main things. The first one is something we all know very well: taxes. This was a regular, required payment that officials collected from pretty much everyone: farmers, traders, herders. You can think of it as the steady, predictable income that paid all the bills: the army, the government officials, the whole shebang. But on top of regular taxes, they had another, much more flexible way of getting resources: tribute. Now, unlike taxes, which were on a strict schedule, tribute was a bit different. It was collected whenever and wherever it was possible. And this quote from our source material really sums it up perfectly. It says, "Tribute was collected as and when it was possible from people who gave a variety of things, more or less willingly." I love that last part. More or less willingly. That little phrase tells you a whole lot, doesn't it? This wasn't always a happy, voluntary gift. And this tribute system was super strategic. The empire wasn't just grabbing whatever it could find. Oh no. It was targeting specific, valuable stuff from different regions. For example, they'd get these warm, woolen blankets from the northwest, and from South India, That's where the gold and precious stones came from. All of this valuable tribute flowed straight to the heart of the empire. Now, the Mauryans' reach for resources didn't just stop at farms and cities. It went much, much deeper, right into the vast forests that covered a huge part of their territory. The people who lived in these forests were, for the most part, pretty independent. They weren't living under the direct thumb of some government official like people in the capital were, but they were still considered part of the empire's resource network, which meant they were still expected to chip in. And the stuff they provided, it was absolutely vital. We're talking about resources you couldn't just farm or mine. Things like timber for building cities, or honey and wax. And most important of all, elephants. War elephants. Think of them as the ancient world's ultimate weapon, like living, breathing tanks. So when you put it all together, you see the Mauryans built this incredible machine for ruling. It had layers, direct rule at the center, provincial control farther out, and this really systematic way of pulling in resources through both taxes and tribute. It was efficient, no doubt about it. It was powerful. But it does leave you with a big question, doesn't it? Can an empire really last if it's held together by just power and spies and collecting stuff? Or, to be truly stable, does it need something more? Maybe a shared idea, or a moral purpose to bind everyone together.
All right, let's dive into one of the ancient world's true heavyweights, the Mauryan Empire. We're talking about a civilization of incredible scale, but our story today zeroes in on its absolutely dazzling capital city and a very special king who would completely rewrite the rules of power. Just take a look at the map. I mean, the sheer size of this thing is mind-boggling. It stretched from the Himalayas all the way down into southern India, uniting this huge, diverse land. This wasn't just empty space either. It was a bustling network of trade, massive armies, and millions of people living in some of the most advanced cities of the time. You know, it's one thing to see the borders on a map, but what did it actually feel like to be standing right in the center of all that power? What was the capital city really like? Well, let's zoom in and find out. We're headed to the imperial capital, a city called Pataliputra. And what's so amazing is that we don't have to just imagine what it was like. We actually have an eyewitness account from someone who was right there, walking its streets. So our guide for this little tour is a guy named Megasthenes. He was a Greek ambassador sent to the Mauryan court, and lucky for us, he wrote everything down. His descriptions give us this incredibly rare, first-hand look at the empire's capital. And from what he tells us, the city was just breathtaking. So Megasthenes says the entire city was surrounded by a massive wooden wall. This wasn't just a fence, it was a powerful statement. And that wall was punctuated by, get this, 570 watchtowers. Can you imagine trying to count them all, just stretching on and on? It was a symbol of absolute strength and security. And if that's not enough, piercing through that wall were 64 gigantic gates. Each one would have been this chaotic, bustling hub of activity, with traders, soldiers, and citizens pouring in and out. This city wasn't just a city, it was a fortress, the secure, beating heart of an entire empire. And inside that fortress, Megasthenes tells us about the king's palace. Now, you'd think it would be all stone, but interestingly, it was mostly built from wood and mud brick. But don't let that fool you. It was covered in these incredibly intricate stone carvings. He also says it was surrounded by lush gardens and even had special enclosures just for keeping birds. It paints a picture of a place that was both powerful and, well, a beautiful sanctuary.
So, we've got this incredible city, this beautiful palace. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, what was life really like for the emperor at the center of it all? As you're about to see, living with that much power came with a very, very steep price.
Whenever the emperor went out in public, it was a total spectacle. I mean, picture this. He's being carried in a solid gold palanquin. His guards are riding on top of elephants that are decked out in gold and silver. There are trained parrots literally flying in circles above his head, and his personal bodyguards, an elite circle of armed women. This was power on full display for everyone to see.
But, and this is a huge but, behind all that glitz and glamour was a pretty dark reality. The emperor lived in constant, crippling fear of being assassinated. All that splendor was matched by an equally intense paranoia.
This fear literally shaped every single part of his day. He had servants whose only job was to taste all of his food to check for poison. And to stop assassins from finding him at night, he never ever slept in the same bedroom 2 nights in a row. It was a life of incredible power, but it was lived inside a golden cage.
But then, along came a ruler who would completely shatter this tradition. The most famous Mauryan emperor of them all, Ashoka, had a totally different idea of what being a king was all about.
Okay, let's break it down. Your typical rulers showed their power through military strength and these over-the-top ceremonies. Orders came from the top and filtered down. Ashoka, he completely flipped the script. He thought real power came from teaching people how to be better, and he decided he was going to take his message straight to the people himself.
But that's a huge question, right? Why? What could possibly happen to the most powerful man in one of the world's biggest empires to make him just abandon tradition and completely rethink what it means to rule? Well, the answer comes from Ashoka's own words, which he had carved in stone for everyone to see. After a really brutal war to conquer a kingdom called Kalinga, the sheer violence and bloodshed just horrified him. He writes that over 100,000 people, that's more than 100,000, were killed. And that victory didn't fill him with pride, it filled him with sorrow.
And what he did next is what makes him so incredible. Ashoka is the only king in all of recorded history to win a war and then give up conquest. He saw the awful cost of violence and decided there had to be a better way to lead. So, if he's not going to rule with an army, how exactly is he going to spread his new ideas? He chose a medium that was public, permanent, and couldn't be ignored: stone. He basically invented a kind of ancient mass media, inscriptions. For the very first time, a ruler tried to talk directly to his subjects on a massive scale. He had his messages carved on rocks and giant pillars all across the empire. And here's the brilliant part: he didn't use the fancy court language. He had them written in Prakrit, the everyday language of the people, so that everyone could understand what he was trying to say.
And you can really see this shift in the empire's symbols. On one side, you've got this polished stone bull. It's a classic symbol of imperial power. It basically screams, "We're strong, don't mess with us." But Ashoka's new tool was the script itself. His power wasn't going to come from scary statues anymore, but from words that could spread ideas about peace and doing the right thing.
So what was this radical message he was carving everywhere? He called it his Dhamma. It wasn't some complex new religion, it was more like a universal code for being a good person. Instead of rules about taxes, his inscriptions talked about being gentle with servants, respecting your elders, being kind to animals, and respecting all religions, not just your own. This was a government trying to build a better society, not just a bigger empire.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought. Ashoka bet everything on a totally new kind of power: the power of an idea. He literally etched his philosophy into the landscape of his empire. And it makes you wonder, if you can carve words into stone, can those words actually change the course of history?
Imagine a conquering emperor at the absolute height of his power who just stops, gives up war completely. It sounds like something out of a fantasy story, but it actually happened. That's the incredible story of Ashoka, and we're going to break it down. So, let's just get right to the heart of it. I mean, think about it. Giving up when you're losing a war? That makes sense. But what could possibly make a ruler turn their back on violence right at their moment of greatest victory? That's the puzzle that makes Ashoka's story so unforgettable.
All right, so to really get why he put down the sword, you've got to first understand the empire he built with it. This wasn't a peaceful kingdom he just happened to inherit. This was a realm forged in fire and conflict.
Just take a look at the scale of this thing. We're not talking about some small territory here. This was the Mauryan Empire, one of the largest the ancient world had ever seen. You can see how it stretches across almost the entire Indian subcontinent. It was massive, managed from huge urban centers like the capital, Pataliputra, and every inch of it was the product of conquest.
And, it's really important to get that an empire is a totally different animal from a kingdom. It's not just a bigger version. Running an empire requires way more resources, huge armies just to patrol the borders, and this massive bureaucracy of officials to collect taxes and keep everything from falling apart. It's a giant machine that runs on power.
So Ashoka had this enormous empire. But if you look at the map, there was one piece of the puzzle still missing, and his mission to claim it, well, that's what changed everything.
Over on the East Coast, there was this independent territory called Kalinga, what we'd call coastal Orissa today. It was the last major holdout. To make his empire truly complete, Ashoka decided it had to be taken. The war he launched to do it was absolutely brutal.
And the human cost? It's just staggering. We actually know these numbers because Ashoka himself wrote them down. In this one war,
Over 100,000 people were killed.
But the horror didn't stop with the dead. Another 150,000 people were captured, ripped from their homes, and taken as prisoners. The devastation was just total.
So, Ashoka had won. Kalinga was his. The empire was finally complete. But as he stood on that battlefield, surrounded by all that destruction, he felt something he didn't expect. Not pride, not triumph, remorse.
And this right here is the turning point of the entire story. By every measure of his time, he'd done it. He had achieved the ultimate goal. So why, in his moment of total victory, was he filled with this profound sense of sorrow?
And here's the incredible part. We don't have to guess how he felt. He told us himself by carving his thoughts into solid rock. He talks about this deep sorrow he felt, seeing the suffering of everyone. And right there, he had this life-changing realization. True victory isn't about conquering people with force. It's about winning them over through something he called Dhamma.
Let's just pause on that for a second, because this is wild. Think about all of human history, all the conquering kings and emperors. Ashoka is the only one we know of who won a massive war and then, as a result, gave up conquest forever. He just stopped.
So, if you're not going to rule by the sword anymore, how do you rule? Well, Ashoka found his answer in this new philosophy, his idea of Dhamma.
So, what exactly was this Dhamma? Now, this is super important. It wasn't a religion. He wasn't trying to convert everybody. There were no specific gods to worship or rituals to perform. He saw it as his duty, kind of like a father's duty to his children, to teach people a moral code for how to live a good and peaceful life.
He started looking around his vast empire and saw all these problems that an army could never fix. Things like cruelty to servants, families feuding with each other, neighbors who couldn't get along. These were the new battles he decided he needed to fight.
And his solution, the message of Dhamma, was actually pretty simple and universal. Be kind to those who serve you. Respect your elders. Show compassion to all living things. And this was a big one. Respect all other religions. It was basically a radical call for common decency in a really violent world.
Okay, so you've got this great idea, this new philosophy. But how do you spread that message across one of the biggest empires on Earth when you don't have, the internet?
Ashoka used the most permanent technology he had, stone. He had his teachings carved onto giant rocks and polished stone pillars all over the empire, so the message would literally last for ages. And for people who couldn't read, he created a whole new class of officials, the Dhamma Mahamata, whose only job was to travel around and explain his teachings to the people. Man, he wasn't just doing this for his own time. He said so himself. He was carving these messages for the future. He desperately wanted his own son and his grandson to learn from his terrible mistake and choose peace instead of war.
So, after all that, Ashoka's story really leaves us with this one big question. A question that's just as important today as it was 2,000 years ago. What's the true measure of strength? Is it the power to conquer other people? Or is it the wisdom and compassion to build a better world?
All right, let's get right into it. We're talking about one of the most famous rulers in all of history, the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka. Now, what makes him so fascinating? Well, for one, he was the very first ruler to take his message directly to his people, and not through some stuffy royal decree, but by literally carving his thoughts onto rocks and pillars for absolutely everyone to see.
And wow, what a message it was. This quote from one of Ashoka's own inscriptions gets right to the heart of his entire story. He says, "A lack of people were killed." That's 100,000 people. Just think about that. This isn't a king bragging about his victory. It's a man filled with anguish, confronting the true, horrifying cost of war. And that moment, well, it changed everything.
So here's how we're going to break down his story. We'll start with that devastating war that almost broke him. Then we'll explore his incredible remorse and try to understand the new philosophy he created, which he called Dhamma. After that, we'll see how he actually put it into action, and finally, we'll look at the powerful legacy he literally etched in stone for all time.
Okay, so our story really kicks off with the battle for Kalinga. Now, Kalinga was the ancient name for what's now coastal Orissa. It was an independent kingdom, and Ashoka, this powerful and pretty ambitious emperor, fought a really brutal war to conquer it and add it to his huge empire. But that victory, it came at a price that's just hard to even imagine. According to his own words, more than 100,000 people were killed. Just try to picture that for a second.
the sheer scale of that violence. For Ashoka, this wasn't just some number on a report. It was a horrifying reality he saw with his own eyes.
And seeing all that destruction, it filled him with this immense sorrow. You know, in an age where kings were basically gods and conquest was the whole point, for an emperor to publicly admit he felt bad about winning a war, that was completely unheard of. It was this huge shift, and it led him to make a decision that makes him a totally unique figure in world history.
Let that sink in. He is the only king in the entire history of the world who won a major war and then just stopped. He gave up conquest completely. He saw the violence, was horrified by what he'd done, and decided to take a completely different path. He chose to conquer hearts and minds with ideas, now a sword.
So, what was this new path? If not war, then what? Well, Ashoka's answer to all the violence and the social problems he saw in his empire was a new philosophy that he called Dhamma.
Now, the word Dhamma itself is just the Prakrit version of the more familiar Sanskrit word Dharma. But the way Ashoka defined it was very specific, and it was tailor-made to solve the problems he cared about most.
And this is what's so important to understand. His Dhamma was not a religion. It wasn't about worshiping a specific god or performing complicated rituals. No, he saw it differently. He believed his duty as a ruler was like that of a father, to teach and guide his subjects. It was a practical, ethical code designed to solve real-world problems and build a society based on compassion and respect.
And he was looking at very specific problems. He was genuinely bothered by things like cruelty to animals, the way slaves and servants were treated, and the constant fighting he saw between neighbors who followed different religions. Dhamma was his direct answer to all these social ills.
But Ashoka wasn't just some dreamer with a nice idea. He was an emperor, a man of action. So he came up with a massive, empire-wide strategy to put his philosophy of Dhamma into practice.
So here's what he did. He appointed special officials called Dhamma Mahamata, whose only job was to go from place to place and teach people these ideas. And his vision was global. He sent messengers way beyond India to Syria, Egypt, Greece, even Sri Lanka. Back home, he built roads, dug wells, and built rest houses for travelers. And then he did something absolutely revolutionary. He set up medical treatment for both people and animals. I mean, that's a level of compassion that was just centuries ahead of its time.
And just look at this map. It's incredible. Each one of those red dots is a place where Ashoka had his messages carved into stone. Just think about the scale of this project. From modern-day Afghanistan all the way down into southern India, he created this massive public information network. Nothing like it had ever been seen before in the world.
So what were these messages that he was so passionate about sharing? Well, they weren't complicated legal codes. They were simple, powerful instructions about how to live a better, more decent life.
The beauty is in their simplicity. He basically told people, be kind to those who serve you, respect your elders, show compassion to every living thing, and be generous to monks and holy men, no matter what their faith is. This was the foundation of his moral vision for the empire. And out of all his messages, this one might be the most profound. Just listen to it. If one praises one's own religion while criticizing another's, one is actually doing greater harm to one's own religion. I mean, that is an incredibly wise and timeless argument for religious tolerance. It's as relevant today as it was over 2,000 years ago.
And that really brings us to our final thought. Ashoka's journey, from a ruthless warmonger to a champion for peace and compassion, is just an incredible model of leadership. And it leaves us with a really important question to think about. In our own modern and often divided world, how can this ancient philosophy of tolerance and kindness actually inform the way we lead today?